In 1860, a nun saved a child from monstrous men, but what they did to her body was pure evil. The year was 1860. The air over the northern coast of Spain carried a strange silence, the kind that hides screams too faint for the world to hear. In a crumbling convent that clung to the edge of the cliffs, a single bell tolled before dawn. They said it was to call for morning prayer, but those who lived nearby whispered that when that bell rang alone, it meant something unholy had happened within those stone walls. Sister Marguerite was known for her kindness, a woman of unshakable faith who cared for the unwanted children of the nearby port. Sailors, beggars, and even thieves brought her infants born of violence and despair, and she took them all in. To the people, she was a light in a century of darkness, until one night when that light flickered for the last time. It began with a scream, sharp, short, and quickly drowned by the sea wind. The next morning, a small boy was found near the convent gates, his body trembling and his eyes wide with something between fear and delirium. He said nothing for hours. Then, when he finally spoke, his words chilled even the priests to silence. He said, "She saved me, but the men, they took her." Who were these men? The villagers had their suspicions, a group of powerful landowners who often came to the convent for donations and left with favors unsaid, but no one dared to accuse them openly. To question them was to vanish. And so, Sister Marguerite's disappearance became another secret swallowed by the sea. But the boy kept something, a small rosary stained with what looked like blood, its silver cross bent and broken. He said she had given it to him before the men came. "Run," she whispered, "don't look back." Those words became his curse, because when he did look back, what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. More than a century later, when the convent ruins were unearthed during coastal restoration, archaeologists uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the chapel floor. Inside were relics of devotion, torn pages of prayer books, rusted chains, and a single human skeleton bound in iron at the wrists, and next to it a rosary identical to the one the boy had described. Was this the final resting place of Sister Marguerite? And if so, what terrible ritual took place inside those walls that the church buried and never spoke of again? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you will discover is not only who those men were, but the unholy secret they tried to erase from history itself. And I promise you this, the final revelation will change everything you thought you knew about faith, innocence, and the price of silence. If you love uncovering the hidden dark corners of history where light dares not reach, make sure you're here, because what comes next will make your heart tremble and your mind question how far humanity can fall in the name of salvation. The convent of Santa Lucia stood on the outer rim of Asturias, Spain, a region caught between faith and famine in the mid-19th century. The year 1860 was a cruel one. The Industrial Revolution had yet to bring mercy to these lands, and the sea had turned cold and unkind. Ships vanished in storms, villages withered under disease. The church, still one of the few pillars of order, offered refuge, but also ruled with an iron silence. Every confession was recorded, every rumor watched, and every miracle measured against the will of men who wore crosses heavier than their consciences. The convent had been built centuries earlier, part of an old network of coastal sanctuaries meant to aid travelers and orphans. By the 1800s, it had fallen into near ruin, its outer stones blackened by salt and time. Only a handful of nuns remained, women who had no family left or who had chosen solitude to escape the gaze of a world too cruel for them. It was said that at night, lights flickered behind the upper windows, candles burning long after prayer hours, shadows moving like restless spirits. The fishermen avoided sailing near its cliffs after dusk. Among the locals, stories circulated, whispers of a hidden passage beneath the convent, leading straight into the rock, a tunnel that reached the sea. Some said it was used centuries before to protect the faithful from pirates. Others claimed it had served a darker purpose, that men of wealth and power used it to visit the convent unseen. To most, it was only legend, but legends in those days were sometimes safer than truths. Sister Marguerite had arrived in Santa Lucia 7 years before her disappearance. She came from France, they said, fleeing the aftermath of a scandal involving a noble family and an orphaned child. She spoke little of her past, devoting herself entirely to the care of the convent's small orphanage. The villagers grew to love her, especially the children, who said she told them stories not from the Bible but from dreams. Yet there was something about her presence that unsettled the older sisters. Her compassion was boundless, yes, but her eyes carried a sadness too deep, as if she had seen something no one should ever see. That sadness deepened the year before the tragedy. Rumors spread that the convent's funding was running dry, and a group of benefactors, local lords, merchants, and even a military officer, had offered assistance. Their visits became more frequent. At first, it was only during the day. Then the candles began to burn late again. The villagers started hearing carriages at odd hours, hooves echoing across the cobbled road leading to the convent gates. And then came the silence. Winter descended over the region with a cruel wind that turned the sea to steel. Several orphans fell ill. The church sent no aid. Only Sister Marguerite stayed awake through the nights, tending to the dying and comforting those who survived. The villagers noticed she stopped coming to Sunday Mass. When questioned, the Mother Superior said only that Marguerite had been reassigned to special duties within the convent, duties that required complete isolation. That was the last official word about her. Yet in taverns and kitchens, whispers told a different tale. Some claimed they saw men in uniforms near the convent walls. Others swore they heard a woman crying out near the cliffs, her voice carried by the wind before being swallowed by the waves. And then, the most unsettling rumor of all, that beneath the convent, near the supposed tunnel, there was a chamber used for cleansing the impure. A place where confession turned into punishment. Whether myth or truth, the atmosphere around Santa Lucia became suffocating. The walls of the convent seemed to absorb secrets, the kind that made even priests look away when asked. So when the boy appeared, barefoot, half-starved, clutching a broken rosary, the villagers knew something dreadful had happened. But fear ruled their hearts more than justice ever could. That night the sea raged louder than the church bell. The convent's windows were dark, and in the distance only one candle burned, in the window of a cell that would never open again. The world would soon forget Sister Marguerite, but the earth beneath Santa Lucia remembered, and what lay buried in its stone would one day rise again, whispering the truth that history refused to keep silent. The story of Sister Marguerite was not written in books. It lived in the trembling voices of those who remembered her face. She was a woman whose kindness felt too large for her small frame. The children said she smelled of lavender and candle smoke, that her hands were always warm even in the coldest winter. They loved how she never scolded them for crying. Tears, she would say, are the body's way of telling the soul it's still alive. Marguerite's origins were a mystery, but whispers claimed she had once belonged to a noble family in southern France, a lineage that vanished after a fire consumed their estate. Whether she fled from guilt, grief, or something darker, no one knew. But her arrival at Santa Lucia brought comfort to the forgotten. She became both nurse and mother to the orphans, teaching them to read, to pray, and to hope. Hope, the cruelest word in times like those. Among the children, one boy stood closest to her heart, a frail, quiet child named Thomas. He had been left on the convent steps wrapped in coarse linen, no older than 6 when Marguerite found him. His first word to her was agua, and she never forgot the way he said it, desperate, like a man dying in a desert. She would often sit by his bed at night, telling him stories about angels who disguised themselves as fishermen or birds that carried prayers across the ocean. In her presence, Tomas began to speak again, to smile, to believe in kindness. But kindness was dangerous in those days, especially a woman's kindness. The Mother Superior, Sister Eugenia, was a severe woman, tall, thin, her eyes sharp as a raven's beak. She ruled the convent with devotion that bordered on fear. Her loyalty was not to God, some whispered, but to the benefactors who kept the convent alive. She saw Marguerite's compassion as weakness, even defiance. "Mercy without permission is pride," she once said in front of the other sisters, her voice echoing through the stone hall. Marguerite lowered her head but did not answer. That silence was the first seed of her downfall. There were others too, the visitors, men who came bearing gifts and gold, claiming to help the poor. But their eyes lingered too long on the young sisters, and their laughter carried too far down the corridors. Marguerite always found a reason to keep Tomas and the other children away during their visits. She would lead them to the garden, singing hymns loud enough to drown out the voices inside. Yet one night, the men came without warning. Tomas woke to the sound of carriage wheels. Crunching gravel, lanterns flickered in the rain. He crept to the window of the dormitory and saw Sister Marguerite arguing with one of the men near the gate, a man in a dark coat with silver buttons and a face that looked carved from stone. She seemed to plead for something. He only smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. That was the last time Tomas saw her free. The next morning, Marguerite was gone. Sister Eugenia told the children she had been called to a distant convent, but Tomas found the broken rosary hidden beneath his blanket, the same one she always carried, its cross bent at the center. He clutched it to his chest, and in that moment, something inside him froze forever. Years later, as an old man, Tomas would say that when he held that rosary, he could still feel the warmth of her hand and hear her whisper through the wind, "Run and never look back." But he did look back. And that single act, that single glance toward the shadows of the convent gate, made him the last living witness to what really happened that night, to what monstrous men did to a woman who dared protect a child the world had already condemned to silence. The first clue came not from words, but from sound. It began one sleepless night when Tomas, trembling under his thin blanket, heard something that didn't belong, the faint rhythm of metal scraping stone. At first, he thought it was the wind clawing at the shutters, but then came a second sound, a muffled cry, too human, too close. It was coming from beneath the floor. He sat up, heart hammering in his chest. The dormitory was dark, the other children still asleep, their breath shallow and slow. He held the rosary tight, its broken cross pressing into his palm until it hurt. The scraping continued, followed by a sound like chains being dragged. Then silence. Then 3 slow knocks, distant and hollow, as if from beneath the chapel itself. Tomas waited for the morning light, but it never truly came. Only the grey hue of coastal mist that made everything seem half dead. He went about his chores in silence, but his ears stayed alert. The nuns moved strangely that day, whispering among themselves, their faces pale. Sister Eugenia kept the chapel locked and forbade anyone to enter. "The floor is under repair," she told them. But Tomas noticed something strange. Her hands trembled when she held the keys. That evening, when she was gone, he followed the faint sound again. The same metallic scrape, softer now, weaker. It led him to the back of the chapel, to a small wooden hatch half hidden behind a tapestry of St. Catherine. He had never noticed it before. The hinges were old, rusted, but someone had recently tried to move it. The dust around it was disturbed, the air colder than the rest of the room. Tomas knelt, his fingers tracing the edges of the hatch. Then he saw it, a single thread of fabric caught in the hinge. It was white linen, streaked with something dark and dry. Blood. He stumbled backward, nearly crying out, but before he could move, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate. He hid behind the tapestry just as Sister Eugenia entered, holding a small lantern. Her face was hard, but her eyes darted around like a hunted animal's. She knelt by the hatch, whispered something in Latin, and pressed her hand to the wood as if to silence whatever was beneath. Then, slowly, she turned the key and locked it again. Tomas waited until she was gone before daring to breathe. The cold in that corner lingered long after the light faded, heavy and still. He could feel something down there, something that was not at peace. Days passed, and the air inside the convent thickened with unease. The children whispered of footsteps in the corridors at night, of the bell ringing without hands to pull its rope. One girl said she saw a shadow kneeling in the chapel when no one was there, a figure in a torn habit, her head bowed, her hands bleeding as she prayed. And then came the smell. It drifted through the walls like a warning, a sweet, sick scent of decay mixed with incense. The older nuns began burning candles day and night, but the odor only grew stronger, seeping from the cracks in the floor. Tomas could no longer sleep. The sound of those 3 knocks haunted his dreams. Every night just before dawn, he swore he heard her voice, faint, broken, whispering his name from below. He didn't know it yet, but that hidden hatch was the first key to unraveling a secret buried far deeper than the convent's foundation. And what lay beneath that floor was not only the truth of what happened to Sister Marguerite. It was the beginning of a horror that the Church had sworn to keep sealed forever. The days that followed twisted into a silence so thick it felt alive. The convent of Santa Lucia, once filled with the faint laughter of children and the soft hum of hymns, had become a place of dread. The air hung heavy with incense and fear. No one spoke of Sister Marguerite anymore. Her name had become forbidden, erased as if she had never existed. But Tomas remembered every whisper, every prayer, every moment she had looked at him with that quiet strength. They echoed louder than the church bells that now refused to ring. Sister Eugenia began enforcing new rules. The children were no longer allowed near the chapel, the garden was locked, and all letters leaving the convent were inspected. She told them that obedience was their salvation, that questioning God's will was sin, but it wasn't God who had silenced Marguerite, it was men. Men who wore symbols of faith, but whose hearts were carved from greed. One night Tomas overheard them again, the visitors, the same heavy boots that had come the night she vanished. They entered through the old gate behind the kitchen, carrying boxes that clinked like chains. The boy crept through the shadows and hid behind a stack of firewood, close enough to hear their voices. She defied the order, one of the men said, his tone sharp and mocking, tried to take the boy away. The bishop demanded secrecy, another replied. If word spread about what we've done here, it would destroy everything. Destroy everything. Those words echoed like a curse. What could one woman have discovered that powerful men feared more than sin itself? Tomas bit his lip until he tasted blood, forcing himself not to cry. The men moved toward the chapel. One of them carried a lantern that illuminated their faces, pale, sweating, twisted with arrogance. Behind them walked Sister Eugenia, her head bowed, clutching her rosary like a weapon. She murmured something about obedience being the highest form of love. But her voice shook. After they vanished inside, the boy ran back to the dormitory. The other children slept, unaware that the walls around them were witnesses to wickedness dressed as virtue. He lay awake, his small hands gripping Marguerite's broken rosary. He prayed, not for forgiveness, but for justice. And even as he whispered, he knew justice had no place in this house. The following morning, the chapel was sealed again. No one was allowed near. The smell of decay was stronger than ever. Sister Eugenia blamed a dead rat trapped beneath the floorboards, but Tomas knew better. He had seen one of the men carrying a blood-stained sack down the corridor before dawn. Days turned to weeks. Hunger gnawed at the children, the food grew scarce, yet the benefactors continued their secret visits. They arrived with wagons at night and left before sunrise, always lighter than when they came. Some of the older orphans whispered that they were taking something from the basement. Not gold, but bones. Tomas tried to speak with one of the younger nuns, Sister Clara, who had always been kind to him. But when he mentioned Marguerite's name, her face went pale. "Don't ever say that again," she hissed, looking over her shoulder. "She was punished for disobedience, that is all." "Punished how?" Tomas asked, trembling. Sister Clara didn't answer. She only whispered, "Pray for her soul," before walking away, her hands shaking so badly that she dropped her rosary. Injustice had rooted itself deep in the stones of Santa Lucia. The faith that once protected the helpless had become a weapon of silence. Each prayer echoed like a lie, each sermon a reminder of what power could conceal. And in the middle of it all, one child held a secret too dangerous to speak, a memory of a woman who defied monsters cloaked in holiness. He didn't yet know that her story was not over, nor that her spirit had already begun to stir beneath the chapel floor, restless and waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. It was on the coldest night of March, when the truth finally began to bleed through the stone. The wind howled so violently that the convent's windows rattled like the teeth of the dead, and the sea below crashed against the cliffs as though trying to tear the land apart. Most of the sisters had retreated to their cells, huddled in prayer. But Tomas couldn't sleep. The smell of decay that had haunted the halls for weeks had grown unbearable, thick enough to choke the breath from his lungs. He followed it again, barefoot, the broken rosary swinging from his wrist like a charm against the darkness. The chapel door was ajar. That alone was wrong. It was always locked. Inside, candles burned low, casting sickly yellow light over the stone floor. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and then he saw it. The tapestry of St. Catherine had been pulled aside, revealing the hidden hatch completely exposed. A single lantern sat beside it, its flame trembling like a frightened soul. Tomas knelt and touched the edge of the hatch. The wood was damp and slick with something he didn't want to name. His fingers shook as he pushed it open. What came up from the dark was not just the stench of death. It was the sound, a low, slow creak, followed by the faint echo. A low, slow creak, followed by the faint echo of water dripping onto metal. He lit the lantern and lowered himself into the passage. The ladder groaned beneath his weight. The air grew colder with every step until he felt as though he had descended into the lungs of the earth itself. The tunnel below was narrow, the walls slick with salt, and there, at the far end, was a small chamber. The room looked like a confessional that had been twisted into something monstrous. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends still stained dark. The walls were carved with symbols, not crosses, but strange circular patterns intersected by lines like a map of stars. In the center stood a wooden chair, splintered and blackened, its arms fitted with iron cuffs. Beneath it lay the remnants of a nun's habit, shredded and crusted with dried blood. Tomas could barely breathe. He stepped closer and saw letters scratched into the stone beside the chair. Faint, uneven, written by a trembling hand. "Deliver the innocent." The lantern flickered. Somewhere in the dark, a sound echoed, the faint brush of fabric, the creak of a chain moving when no one touched it. Tomas spun around, his heart pounding. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence that felt both near and nowhere. And then, for the briefest instant, he saw her. A figure at the far end of the chamber, cloaked in shadow, her veil torn, her face pale as the moonlight that seeped through the cracks above. Her hands were bound in front of her, yet she lifted one finger to her lips, as if warning him to stay silent. He froze. The figure flickered, there then gone, leaving only the echo of chains swaying slowly back and forth. The lantern flame hissed and died. Tomas scrambled back up the ladder, gasping for air as he burst into the chapel. The moment he stepped onto the floor, the church bell rang once, a deep, hollow toll that shook the walls. None of the sisters came. No one moved. Only silence followed. When dawn came, the hatch was sealed again. The tapestry was back in place, and the lantern he had taken down with him was gone. No one believed his story. Sister Eugenia struck him for lying. "You saw only what your guilt created," she said coldly. "You dreamed what you wanted to believe." But Tomas knew the truth. He had seen the words carved into the stone. "Deliver the innocent." He had seen the chair, the blood, the vision of the woman who refused to die in silence. From that day on, the convent grew colder. The candles burned shorter, the walls seemed to weep salt, and the children began waking at night, crying that they heard chains beneath their beds. Even the sea grew quieter, as if listening. Something had been awakened beneath Santa Lucia, and it would not rest until every secret buried there was brought to light, no matter the cost. The days after Tomas's discovery unfolded like a fever dream. The convent seemed to breathe. Floors creaked where no one walked, and the air trembled with whispers too soft to catch, yet too human to ignore. Even Sister Eugenia began to change. Her sermons grew erratic, her voice brittle, her eyes hollow. She avoided the chapel altogether, locking herself in her chamber for hours and muttering prayers that sounded more like bargains than confessions. Then one morning a strange visitor arrived. He was not a priest, though he wore the garb of one, his collar stained, his coat too fine for a man of God. He introduced himself as Father Benoit, sent from France by the higher order to inspect the convent's spiritual integrity. His accent matched Marguerite's, and the moment Tomas heard it, something in his chest ached. The sisters treated him with reverence, though fear lingered in their eyes. He asked questions, too many. How long had the chapel been sealed? Why were records missing from the convent's archives? And why did the church in Asturias never receive confirmation of Sister Marguerite's transfer? That last question froze the room. No one answered. That night, Father Benoit requested to see the chapel alone. Sister Eugenia refused, but her authority had begun to crumble. He entered anyway, lantern in hand. Tomas, hiding in the corridor, watched as the heavy doors closed behind him. Minutes passed. Then the bell tower rang once, though no one was there to pull the rope. When Benoit emerged, his face was pale. He ordered the sisters to gather in the refectory at dawn, said he had found something beneath the altar that could not remain hidden. But before morning came, he was gone. His room was empty, the bed unslept in, his lantern still burning on the floor. Only one thing remained, a folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax and marked with the symbol carved into the underground chamber, a circle intersected by 7 lines. Sister Eugenia burned the paper before anyone could read it. "The devil tests us," she declared, her voice trembling. "He seeks to unmake our faith." Yet the fire refused to consume the seal. The wax melted, but the symbol remained, glowing faintly red until the ashes turned cold. That same day, the sea grew wild again. The waves crashed against the cliffs so violently that parts of the outer wall began to crumble. In the chaos, Tomas slipped into the chapel once more, driven by something between terror and resolve. He approached the altar, running his hands along its surface, until he felt a seam, a hidden panel beneath the marble. He pried it open with a candle holder, revealing a small, iron-bound box. Inside was a bundle of letters written in Marguerite's delicate hand. Most were prayers, but the last one was different. To whoever finds this, know that they came not for me, but for what I carried. The child was never meant to live. His blood is the debt they swore to erase." Tomas read the words again and again, trembling. The child was never meant to live. He dropped the letter and stumbled backward, his mind spinning. The child, she meant him. The bell rang again, this time 3 times in slow succession, echoing through the storm. And from beneath the chapel floor, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of chains stirring once more, as if something below had heard the truth and was ready to rise. Tomas didn't sleep that night. The storm clawed at the convent, lightning splintering the sky as if trying to expose the sins buried beneath its stones. He sat in the chapel, staring at the letter in his trembling hands, reading and rereading the same line until the ink blurred in his tears. The child was never meant to live. At dawn, the storm subsided, leaving a silence more violent than the thunder. The convent was in disarray. The sisters whispered of omens and of Father Benoit's disappearance, but Tomas knew he couldn't leave. He needed to know why Marguerite had saved him and what this debt of blood meant. He returned to the hidden chamber beneath the altar, clutching a candle that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The air was colder than before. The chains still hung from the ceiling, their ends blackened as though scorched by fire. But this time, he noticed something he'd missed. A crest carved into the stone, a serpent devouring its own tail. Around it were etched 7 names, nearly erased by time. He traced them one by one until he reached the last, Benoit. A chill sank into his bones. He pried open a small alcove near the crest and found a leather-bound book, its pages brittle and reeking of salt. It was written in Latin and French, filled with records of experiments of purification and rites of absolution. At first the words made no sense, but then buried in the middle of the text, he found an entry dated Arch 1862, signed by Sister Marguerite d'Anjou. She wrote of an order known as Les Veilleurs de la Chair, the Watchers of the Flesh, a secret sect within the Church formed centuries earlier to erase the taint of sin from the bodies of the cursed. They believed certain bloodlines carried a mark of defilement, and that by ritual cleansing they could purify mankind. Tomas's blood ran cold as he read. The convent had not been a sanctuary. It was one of their sanctuaries of erasure. Marguerite had defied them. She had taken one of their marked children, a boy meant to be sacrificed, and fled with him to the northern coast, hiding under the guise of a nun. The sect had followed her, wearing the robes of priests, posing as inquisitors of faith. They had punished her for her betrayal, burying her alive beneath the chapel she had consecrated with her mercy. Tomas staggered backward, the candlelight quivering. He was that child. The blood they had called cursed was his. He turned another page and froze. There was a second signature, Eugenia de la Croix, Marguerite's closest companion. The book revealed that Eugenia had been one of them all along, sent to watch Marguerite, to ensure the ritual's completion. But she had faltered when she saw the boy's face. She had spared him, lying to the sect, and vowed to keep him hidden under the Church's shadow. The truth crashed through him like thunder. All these years, his devotion had been built upon a lie. Sister Eugenia, his protector, had been the architect of Marguerite's doom, and yet also his secret savior. He stumbled to his feet, rage and confusion tearing at his chest. Behind him a voice whispered, soft and hoarse, "You weren't meant to see that." He spun around. Sister Eugenia stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling as if caught between blessing and curse. "It was never meant for you," she said. "You were supposed to live in peace, unaware." "Peace?" he spat. "While she rotted beneath us?" Her eyes glistened. "You don't understand, Tomas. If they learn you still live, they will come again. They never stopped watching. Lightning flared through the cracked, stained glass, cutting her face in half. One side angelic, the other clutching the book. Then let them come. I want the truth. Eugenia's tears fell silently. The truth, she whispered, is a hunger that eats the soul. Marguerite learned that too late. And as the final word left her lips, the chapel bell rang once more, deep, resonant, and wrong. The ground trembled beneath them, and from the sealed floor below, a voice rose, broken and distant, yet unmistakably human, calling Thomas by name. The sound that rose from beneath the chapel floor was not merely a voice. It was a cry pulled from centuries of agony. It spoke his name in a tone that carried both love and despair. Thomas. The air thickened as dust fell from the rafters, and every candle in the chapel flickered as though suffocating. Sister Eugenia dropped to her knees, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Don't answer her," she pleaded. "She is not of God anymore." But Thomas was already moving. Something inside him, something older than memory, compelled him forward. He knelt at the spot where Marguerite's body was said to rest and pressed his hand to the cold stone. "If you can hear me," he whispered, "tell me why." The ground responded with a tremor, a faint hum that grew until it was almost a heartbeat. The marble cracked beneath his palm, revealing a narrow slit of blackness. From within, the scent of salt and decay spilled into the air, followed by a whisper that seemed to pierce straight into his mind. "Because you were never theirs to keep." The floor gave way. Thomas fell into darkness, the world above swallowed by dust and the sound of the chapel collapsing. He landed hard on damp earth. When his eyes adjusted to the faint light filtering through the cracks above, he saw he was in the hidden crypt, the one beneath the chamber of chains. Dozens of skeletons lay in ordered rows, their skulls bearing strange carvings. Each was marked with the same symbol he'd seen in the book, the serpent consuming itself. In the center of the room was a stone coffin. Its lid had been pried open from the inside, and inside the coffin sat what was left of Sister Marguerite. Her body was unnaturally preserved, her skin pale as marble, her eyes impossibly open. Around her neck hung a rosary made of bone. Thomas stumbled backward, choking on terror. But then she spoke again, not with her lips, but with a voice that echoed directly inside his skull. "You carry what they feared most, my child, the blood that remembers." Visions erupted behind his eyes, flashes of fire, chains, screaming voices, and a ritual performed in the name of purity. He saw himself as a baby, covered in markings drawn with ash, a circle of men chanting around him. Marguerite burst through the circle, clutching him in her arms, screaming words he couldn't understand. And then, betrayal. Eugenia's face crying as she turned the key that locked the tomb. When the vision faded, Thomas was on his knees before Marguerite's coffin, sobbing. "Why me?" he whispered. "What am I?" "The last of the marked," she replied. "The end of their blood. They believed your kind was cursed, but it was not a curse. It was remembrance. You are the vessel of what they tried to erase, the proof that their holiness was built on blood." Above him, faintly, he could hear footsteps, the nuns screaming, doors slamming, and then a voice that did not belong to any of them, deep, calm, foreign. "Seal the doors, burn the chapel." The watchers had returned. Eugenia's voice echoed faintly from above. "Run, Thomas, they've come for you." Marguerite's corpse began to glow faintly, the air around her pulsing with warmth that felt almost like mercy. "Go, my child," she whispered. "The living will not understand, but you must remember, you must tell them what they did here." Thomas reached out, But as his fingers brushed her hand, she crumbled into ash, scattering like dust caught in a beam of light. At the same moment, the crypt door burst open. Several figures in black robes entered, their faces hidden behind masks shaped like twisted halos. One carried a torch, another a chain. He recognized the symbol on their chests, the serpent devouring itself. "By order of the Holy Watch," one intoned, "the impurity ends tonight." But as they approached, the ground shook violently. The walls cracked, spilling seawater through the stones. Marguerite's ashes rose into the air, swirling around Thomas like a storm. The masked men fell back, shielding their eyes, shouting prayers that turned to screams. A voice, hers, yet larger than life, filled the crypt. "No more blood for your salvation." A flash of light erupted, blinding, divine yet furious. When the dust settled, the crypt was silent. The intruders lay lifeless on the floor, their masks cracked, their bodies covered in the same carvings as the skeletons. Thomas crawled toward the narrow stairway, his breath ragged, the book still clutched to his chest. Above, flames licked the chapel walls as the convent burned. He staggered out through the ruins, collapsing on the cold stones outside. Behind him, the bell rang one final time, once, long and mournful, before the tower crumbled into the sea. He turned to look back, and for a moment, through the smoke, he saw her, Sister Marguerite, standing at the edge of the cliff, her veil fluttering in the wind. She smiled, a soft, sorrowful smile. Then she vanished into the mist, and Thomas understood her vengeance was not for herself, but for every forgotten soul the Watchers had damned in the name of purity. The truth was no longer buried. It lived within him, burning like holy fire. The flames that devoured the convent left behind more than ashes. They unearthed a silence heavy with revelation. When dawn broke, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the villagers who gathered at the cliffs swore they could still hear the echo of that bell tolling from beneath the waves. And standing among them, his face pale and eyes hollow, was Thomas. He said nothing. He only clutched the old rosary in his hand, the same one Sister Marguerite had once given to a child she tried to save. In the weeks that followed, word of the fire spread through the region like a ghost story. The church called it a tragic accident. The local papers claimed lightning had struck the chapel, but those who had seen the strange lights over the sea that night whispered otherwise. They said justice had come for the unholy, that the dead had finally spoken. Thomas disappeared soon after. Some said he fled to the mountains, others believed he was taken by the same forces that had tried to bury the truth. But a few decades later, a journal was discovered in a small archive in Burgos. Its pages stained with seawater, its handwriting faint but unmistakable. It told the entire story of the Watchers, of the rituals performed in the convent, of the children taken, and the woman who defied them. It was signed simply, T.M. Historians who read it were divided. Some dismissed it as folklore. Others saw in it something far more unsettling, a reflection of countless forgotten crimes committed in the name of purity and power. Because what happened to Sister Marguerite was not unique. Across Europe and the colonies, countless women, healers, teachers, nuns, were silenced for questioning those who wielded faith like a weapon. Their stories were buried under centuries of doctrine and denial. The convent's ruins still stand today, fenced off and overgrown, a place avoided by tourists. Yet sometimes, when the wind moves through the broken windows, the air carries a strange harmony, like distant chanting, and beneath the stones the sea continues to erode the last traces of what once was. But truth, as history shows, never truly disappears. It merely waits for the right moment to rise again. Perhaps that is the lesson buried within this dark tale, that evil often hides behind symbols of holiness, that silence more than cruelty itself. is what keeps injustice alive. And that courage, the kind Sister Marguerite showed, is the only force strong enough to defy centuries of corruption. Every time history repeats itself, it's because we've allowed ourselves to forget. And maybe that's why stories like this one matter. Not to glorify pain, but to remind us that behind every forgotten martyr, every erased name, there was a person who dared to say no in a world built on obedience. As the sea continues to wash the cliffs clean, it also carries with it a message, one that Marguerite once whispered to a terrified child, and that Thomas carried to his grave. Do not be afraid to remember, because memory is rebellion, and every story remembered is one less buried in the dark. If you've made it this far, you now know the secret that was never meant to be spoken, the truth buried beneath stone, prayer, and centuries of silence. But before you go, there's something you should decide for yourself. Do you believe Sister Marguerite en spirit truly found peace that night? Or do you think her voice still echoes through the ruins, waiting for someone else to uncover what remains hidden? Type your answer below. Tell me what you believe. Because stories like this are more than history. They were reflections of the darkness humanity tries to forget, the injustices that live on when no one dares to speak. And maybe, by remembering them together, we give voice to those who were never allowed to tell their own stories. If you felt something stir while hearing about her courage, if you believe that truth, no matter how terrifying, deserves to be seen, then this is your place. Every week, we uncover another secret the world tried to erase, another forgotten soul, another page of history that still bleeds. And here is your promised bonus. The next chapter of this investigation and what was found beneath the crypt when divers explored the flooded tunnels years later will be revealed only to subscribers who stay until the end of our next story. So, if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because what comes next will connect everything you've just heard and reveal that Sister Marguerite's story was only the beginning of something far greater and far darker than anyone ever imagined. Now tell me in the comments, do you believe the past can truly rest, or do some voices refuse to fade? The sea is calm now, but its silence feels heavier than before, as if it's guarding something. The ruins of the convent stand like a scar on the cliffs, untouched by time, wrapped in fog. Locals still refuse to go near it after sunset. Some say they see a flicker of light in the old chapel window, as if a candle still burns where no living soul remains. Others swear they've heard a voice carried on the wind, whispering the same words again and again. Remember me. Sister Marguerite's name has faded from official records. The church never admitted what happened there, and no monument marks her grave. But stories have a way of surviving, not through marble or scripture, but through the mouths of those who still care to speak them. And maybe that is where she truly lives, in every person who refuses to let injustice be forgotten. If you stayed until the end, you've kept her story alive. You've joined a small circle of those who listen when history tries to whisper its buried truths. I guard the memory. Below, so we know you're one of the few who refuse to look away. But before we close this chapter, there's something you should know. When archaeologists returned years later to study the cliffside erosion, they discovered a second passage leading away from the collapsed crypt, a tunnel that stretched beneath the sea, carved by hand, lined with symbols identical to those of the Watchers. The entrance was sealed before anyone could enter. Officially, it was declared unsafe. Unofficially, it was never reopened. So the question remains, what lies at the end of that tunnel, and why was it built to lead into the ocean? Next week, we'll follow that mystery, the story of the ice-submerged passage, where voices have been recorded in a language no scholar can translate, and divers have vanished, trying to uncover its secret. Because in history, every truth buried in darkness leaves behind a trail, and for those brave enough to follow it, there's always another door waiting to be opened. Until then, keep your light close. You'll need it.